In the spring of 1200 BC, a little girl named Nefertari stood in the courtyard of the Temple of Amun at Karnak while priests shaved her head completely bald. She was just 9 years old. Her father, a minor official, had brought her there 3 days earlier because he owed a debt to the temple that he couldn't pay with silver or grain. So he paid for it with his daughter. Nefertari didn't understand what was happening. She only knew that her father told her she was being given a great honor, that she would serve the gods, and that she should be thankful and obedient. As the bronze razor scraped across her scalp, taking away every bit of the long black hair she used to wear in beautiful braids, Nefertari began to cry. An older priestess slapped her across the face. "Servants of the gods do not cry," the woman said coldly. "You have no tears anymore. You have no name anymore. You belong to Amun now, and Amun does not accept weakness." This was how Nefertari's new life began, a life that would last 43 years. A life of confinement, control, and silent suffering behind walls covered with images of divine glory. She would never leave the temple. She would never marry. She would never own anything or make decisions about her own body or her future. She would serve quietly until she died and was buried in an unmarked grave, with no family to mourn her and no name left for history to remember. But here's what most people don't know. Nefertari was not special or unusual. She was not just one case of abuse in an otherwise good system. She was one of thousands of girls and women who spent their whole lives in Egyptian temples, given titles that sounded holy but hid a much darker truth. They were called God's wives, servants of the god, hands of the goddess, pure ones, and divine adoratrices. These were beautiful titles for a system that destroyed lives as efficiently as any battlefield, a system that exploited weakness like any slave market and erased identities as completely as a conqueror wiping out a defeated enemy's capital. This is the story of what Egyptian priests did to temple virgins. And before we go further, you need to know that what I'm describing is not myth or made-up drama. It's proven by temple inscriptions, old records written on papyrus, and accounts by ancient historians who saw these things happen. If you want to understand how religious power can be used to take advantage of the weak, how sacred language can hide terrible abuse, then subscribe to this channel right now. We explore the darkest sides of ancient history using real evidence and sources. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and whether you've ever visited these temples in Egypt without knowing what really happened behind their walls. Now, let me tell you about the myth versus the truth of temple virgins in ancient Egypt, and why almost everything you think you know about them is probably wrong. But I'm warning you, what comes next is much darker than you expect.
When most people hear about temple virgins or priestesses in ancient Egypt, they imagine something elegant and noble. They picture graceful women in white linen, performing holy rituals, respected servants of the gods, living lives full of spiritual purpose. They think of the Vestal Virgins of Rome, but in an Egyptian style. Holy women who are honored, protected, and who chose their sacred path freely. But this beautiful picture is completely false. And it's false in ways that show how powerful ancient propaganda really was. It shows how perfectly those who built this system managed to hide what they were truly doing behind pretty words and sacred symbols. Let me explain what these women actually were. According to Egyptian religion, the most common word for them was Hemet, which literally means servant of the god, or sometimes wife of the god. Other titles included Datet, meaning worshipper of the god, Shemayat, meaning singer or musician, and Kener, a more general term for temple attendant. Each title came with different duties and rankings, but they all shared one thing. The women were bound to the temple, controlled by the priests, and forced to follow rules that took away their freedom, and even their sense of self. The word virgin in this context needs to be explained because modern people often misunderstand it. In temple life, purity or virginity didn't just mean someone who had never had sex. It usually meant ritual purity, being free from anything considered unholy. But this ritual purity was often enforced through real physical control over the women's bodies and their private lives. The women were kept pure for the gods, which in reality meant they were kept available for priests who claimed to act as divine representatives. Now, here's what's important to understand. Most of these women didn't choose this life. They were given to the temples, often as children, through systems that removed their right to choose long before they could even understand what was going on. Some were offered by their families as gifts to the gods, to gain favor, fulfill a vow, or simply reduce the number of mouths to feed. The dedication was presented as a religious act of faith and devotion, but for the girl, it meant being abandoned forever, cut off from her family, with no way back. But wait, it gets worse. Some girls were handed over as payment for debts, just like what happened to Nefertari. Temples in ancient Egypt were powerful and wealthy. They owned land, lent out grain and silver, and collected taxes. When families couldn't repay what they owed, they could give their children, usually daughters, as payment. These girls would then serve the temple for life. This was legal human trafficking disguised as holy service. And then there were the girls taken from conquered lands or families who had lost favor with the religious elite. Egyptian armies captured people from Nubia, Libya, and the Levant. Among these captives were girls and young women chosen for sacred servitude. They were brought to Egypt, assigned to different temples, and forced into sacred servitude with no chance of ever escaping. But here's what will shock you most. The girls were often extremely young when this began. Records and temple inscriptions show that some entered service as early as 8 or 9 years old.
Some sources say the girls could be even younger, though it's hard to know for sure because ancient records didn't always include exact birth dates. What we do know is that many of these girls hadn't even reached puberty when they were taken from their families and given to the temples. They were children, too young to consent, too young to understand what was really happening to them. Let me tell you about another girl. Her name was Mutmua, and she was only 8 years old when soldiers came to her village in Nubia after Egypt conquered the region during the reign of Thutmose III. The soldiers were collecting tribute: gold, ivory, grain, and children. Mutmua was chosen along with 12 other girls from different families in the area. The girls were tied together with ropes and marched north toward Egypt. The journey was hundreds of miles long and took many weeks. Mutmua didn't speak Egyptian. She had no idea what was happening or where she was going. She only knew that she had been torn away from her mother, her siblings, and everything she knew. She cried all the time during the march, until one of the Egyptian guards beat her and told her that crying was not allowed. After that, she learned to cry silently, with tears rolling down her cheeks, but no sound escaping her lips. When the girls arrived at Thebes, they were taken to different temples. Mutmua was given to the temple of Mut, a goddess connected with motherhood and queenship. The painful irony would become clear to her years later when she learned Egyptian. She was serving a goddess of mothers while being denied the chance to ever become a mother herself. Now listen carefully, because what I'm about to explain next is the process that turned girls like Nefertari and Mutmua from children with families and names into property owned by religious institutions. And this process was carefully designed to break their spirit and prepare them for a lifetime of complete obedience. When a girl was chosen for temple service, whether through family offering, debt payment, or military conquest, she went through a series of rituals meant to erase her old identity and rebuild her as a servant of the god. These rituals didn't happen quickly. They lasted days or even weeks, slowly breaking her down and reshaping her into someone who would obey without question. The first ritual was called purification through water. The girl would be taken to a sacred pool or basin inside the temple for ritual bathing. That might sound harmless, but it wasn't. The baths were led by priests and senior temple women. The girl's clothes from her old life would be stripped away, and her body would be washed again and again with water mixed with natron, a natural salt. But here's where it gets disturbing. These baths were not just for cleaning. They were actually invasive inspections disguised as holy rituals.
The priests would check the girl's body, pretending it was to make sure she was pure and flawless enough to serve the gods. Little girls were touched and examined by strange men who told them this was sacred duty, that the gods required it, that resisting or showing discomfort would anger the divine powers. Let me tell you what happened to Nefertari during her purification bath. She was taken to a stone pool in an enclosed courtyard where 3 priests and 2 older temple women were waiting.
She was told to take off her clothes. When she hesitated, frightened and embarrassed, one of the women grabbed her roughly and pulled them off. Nefertari was pushed into the cold water. She shivered and tried to cover herself with her hands. One of the priests stepped into the pool with her. He told her to stand still and keep her arms at her sides. Then his hands moved over her body, touching her in ways that made her feel deeply uncomfortable. When she flinched away, he grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise it and said the gods were watching, that this was a test to prove her worthiness, and that if she failed, her family would be shamed and the gods might punish all of Egypt. Nefertari stood frozen in fear while the priest's inspection continued. She didn't understand what was being done to her or why. She only knew these were priests, men who claimed to speak for the gods, and she had always been taught to obey them. So she stayed still and endured it, tears sliding silently down her face, mixing with the water in the pool. This first violation, disguised as a holy act, set the tone for the rest of her life. It taught her that her body was not her own, that it belonged to the temple, and that priests had the right to touch and control her whenever they wanted.
From the very first day, the girls learned that they would be examined, controlled, and made to obey, no matter how uncomfortable or scared they felt. Their pain didn't matter because religion was used to justify every invasion of their bodies.
But it didn't stop there. After the purification came the shaving ritual I mentioned earlier. The girl's head would be completely shaved bald. This was common for certain temple servants and priests, supposedly to keep them pure and separate from ordinary people. But shaving also had a deeper psychological purpose. Hair, especially for young girls who wore it in pretty styles, was part of their identity. Removing it took away that identity. It made them all look the same, stripped of individuality and pride. When Nefertari looked at herself in a bronze mirror after her head was shaved, she didn't recognize the bald child staring back at her. That reflection wasn't Nefertari anymore. It was someone the temple had created. The shaving was often followed by renaming. The girl's birth name, the name her parents gave her, was taken away and replaced with a new one chosen by the temple. Sometimes the new names honored the gods, like Beloved of Amun, Beautiful for her Thor, or She who belongs to Mut. Other names were simpler, just describing their role, like She who sings or She who serves. Nefertari was renamed Nefert Nebet, which meant Beautiful is the Lady, a reference to the goddess. Her birth name was forbidden. She was told never to speak it again, never even to think about it. If she was ever caught using it, she would be punished. The name her mother had given her, the one that tied her to her family and her past, was declared dead, just like the life she had lost. This renaming finished the symbolic death of who she used to be. She was no longer her father's daughter. She no longer belonged to her family. She was now a creation of the temple, made for it and owned by it. But wait, because here's where the dedication process takes an even darker turn that you need to understand.
After purification and renaming came what the ancient records call the divine marriage ceremony. Girls who were chosen for special temple service went through a ritual where they were symbolically married to the god they would serve. This ceremony was described as a great honor, becoming the bride of a god, something far greater than any normal marriage could ever be. The details of the ritual changed depending on the temple and the god, but the main parts were usually the same. The girl would be dressed in bridal clothes, taken before the statue or shrine of the god, and made to speak vows of eternal loyalty and service to her divine husband. The priests would act as the god's voice, saying that he accepted his new bride and would bless her in return for her obedience and purity.
Let me tell you what Mutmua went through during her divine marriage to the goddess Mut at Thebes. By that time, she was 10 years old. She had already spent 2 years in the temple learning Egyptian and how to perform her basic duties. She was dressed in fine white linen, far more beautiful than anything she had ever worn in her Nubian village. Her bald head was covered with a wig made of detailed braids. Her face was painted with makeup, and she was decorated with jewelry. Then she was led into the temple's inner sanctuary, a dark stone room she had never been allowed to enter before. The air smelled of oil and incense, and flickering lamps cast shadows across the towering statue of the goddess. The eyes of the statue, made with precious stones, seemed to stare directly at her as she walked closer. The high priest stood before the statue. Around her, other priests and senior temple women formed a silent circle. The high priest began to chant in a deep, echoing voice that bounced off the walls. He spoke in an ancient form of Egyptian that Mutmua had studied but still didn't fully understand. He claimed to speak for the goddess herself, saying Mut was welcoming Mutmua as her chosen bride. Then Mutmua was told to repeat the vows she was taught. I give myself to Mut. My body is her temple. My life is her property. I will serve in purity and obedience forever. I belong to the goddess now and forever. I have no other lord, no other family, no other purpose but service. Mutmua repeated every word. She didn't have a choice. She didn't truly understand what she was saying, but those words would tie her to the temple for the rest of her life. The priests witnessed the ceremony and recorded it officially. From that moment on, Mutmua legally belonged to the temple. She had no rights, no freedom, and no way out. Here's what you need to understand about this divine marriage. It wasn't just symbolic. It had real consequences. Once a girl was married to a god, she could never marry a man. That choice was gone forever. She could never have children that were legally recognized. She couldn't own or inherit property. She couldn't ever leave the temple. She was tied to it for life. And there's something even darker about this ritual, something that would soon become clear in what happened next. It had to do with how priests saw themselves as the living representatives of the gods, and what that belief meant for these so-called divine brides.
If you're starting to realize that what happened to these girls was organized exploitation disguised as holy devotion, that every ritual was meant to break their spirit and make them completely obedient, then share this story. Hit that like button to help more people learn this hidden history, and tell me in the comments what you think about systems that claim divine authority to justify control. Now, let me tell you what daily life inside the temple was actually like for these girls. And I'm warning you, it gets even worse. Life inside the temple for the servants of the gods was strict, silent, and completely controlled. Everything was planned to stop them from ever escaping or rebelling. Let's look at what a normal day would have been like for someone like Nefertari after years inside the temple. By then, the shock was gone, but the heavy truth of her permanent captivity had sunk in completely. She would wake up before sunrise in the shared sleeping rooms where all the younger temple women stayed. The rooms were crowded, and older women who had been there for decades acted as supervisors. Privacy didn't exist. They slept on rough reed mats with almost nothing to their names. Any personal item from their old lives had been taken away when they first arrived. They owned nothing. They were nothing, just servants of the god. After waking up, the women would perform their morning purification, washing with water and natron, and then dress in simple white linen clothes that showed their temple status. Then they'd begin their assigned tasks. Most spent long hours doing repetitive labor, weaving linen for the temple, preparing food and drink offerings for the gods, grinding grain for bread, brewing beer, or tending to temple gardens. All this work supported the temple's wealth and economy, but it was presented as holy service. Some women had special religious roles. The Shamayat, the singers and musicians, practiced hymns and played instruments like the sistrum, a sacred rattle used for the goddess Hathor, or small harps and drums. They performed during rituals. Their music meant to please the gods and bring blessings. But here's what made life truly unbearable. Throughout all of this, silence was strictly enforced. They could only speak when given permission. Temple women had to move quietly, keep their heads down, and never speak unless spoken to by superiors. Any unnecessary talking was punished. This silence served many purposes. It stopped the women from forming friendships that might lead to rebellion, it kept the atmosphere serious and submissive, and it made each woman feel completely isolated, even when surrounded by others. They lived alone in their own minds, filled with fear and hopelessness, realizing that nothing in their lives would ever change. Let me tell you about Nefertari's closest friend in the temple, a girl named Takayat. She had come from a small village in the Delta region and had already been in the temple for 5 years. She arrived when she was just 11 years old. Takayat worked next to Nefertari in the weaving hall, sitting beside her for hours every day at their looms making linen for the temple. They weren't supposed to talk while they worked, but sometimes when the overseer was far away, Takayat would whisper to Nefertari, short, soft sentences barely louder than a breath. "I dreamed about my mother last night."
Do you remember what fruit used to taste like? How many more years until we die? One day, the overseer noticed. She sneaked up behind Takayat while the girl was whispering and hit her hard on the back of her head with a wooden rod. Takayat fell forward into her loom, blood dripping from her scalp. The overseer grabbed her and dragged her out of the workshop while shouting loudly to everyone, "This is what happens to those who break silence. This is what happens to those who forget they are servants with no voice of their own." Takayat was taken away. Nefertari didn't see her for 3 days. When Takayat finally came back, she didn't talk at all, not even in whispers. Her eyes were empty. Whatever had been done to her during those 3 days had broken something inside her. She worked like a machine at her loom, but never looked at Nefertari. She didn't respond when Nefertari tried to quietly talk to her during the short breaks when talking was technically allowed. 2 months later, Takayat disappeared from the sleeping area. The overseer said that Takayat had been found impure, had failed in her service, and had been returned to the gods. No one was told what that meant. No one knew where Takayat had gone, but every woman understood the warning. This is what happens when you resist. This is what happens when you fail. Any one of you could be next. But the official records don't mention anything else. The watching and control went much deeper than just daily work in silence. These women were constantly watched by senior priestesses and priests who ran the temple. Their movements were restricted to certain areas. They couldn't leave the temple grounds without permission and an escort. They couldn't meet anyone from outside. Contact with their families was either completely forbidden or tightly controlled and supervised. And the control went even further. The women were regularly inspected to make sure they stayed pure. These inspections, done by priests, involved personal and invasive examinations of their bodies. The priests said it was necessary to make sure the women were still pure and hadn't been corrupted by unclean thoughts or acts. But what these inspections really were repeated violations, disguised as holy rituals. Nefertari went through these inspections every month. She would be called to a small room where a priest waited. She was told to take off her clothes and stand while he examined her. His hands would move over her body as he muttered prayers and claimed to be checking for signs of impurity. Nefertari learned how to leave her body during these moments, how to let her mind drift away while her body was being touched and invaded. She learned that fighting back was useless and only brought punishment. She learned that her body wasn't hers. It belonged to the temple. The priests could touch her any time they said it was for religious reasons. If a woman seemed unhappy or rebellious, if she cried too much, looked distracted, or didn't perform her duties with enough devotion, she would be reported to the temple authorities and punished. Punishments included being forced to do extra hard work, being denied food, being beaten by older temple women, or being locked alone in dark storage rooms for days. And there was something else that made escape impossible, even for women who thought about it. Many of these girls had been taken so young that they barely remembered life outside the temple.
Others had been there for so long that they wouldn't know how to survive outside. They had no money, no property, and no useful skills to live independently. They had no families left because those ties had been deliberately cut. Even if one managed to get outside the temple, where could she go? What could she do? How would she live? This total control meant that high walls and locked gates weren't even necessary. The women were trapped mentally and economically as much as physically. They were trapped by having no choices, by knowing that the temple was the only world they'd ever known, and by realizing that any resistance would only bring pain. Now, let me tell you about the training and brainwashing that came with this strict daily life. Because the temples didn't just want obedient workers, they wanted women who truly believed that their slavery was sacred, that their pain was holy service, that their lack of freedom was actually the highest spiritual honor. From the moment they were dedicated, the girls were told they were blessed. They were told they had been chosen by the gods for special favor, and that their lives of service were worth more than any ordinary life. They were taught that the priests who gave them orders spoke with the voice of the gods, and that disobeying temple officials was the same as disobeying the gods, bringing punishment both in this life and the next. They were told that their bodies were not their own, but temples that held the divine spirit. It sounded holy until you saw how that belief was used. If your body is a temple of the god, then the priests, who claim to act for the god, can enter that temple. If you are the bride of a god, then the god's representatives can claim the rights of that divine marriage. This belief, taught from childhood, made these women accept acts they would have resisted otherwise, because resistance meant defying the gods themselves. They were also taught that the outside world was dirty and dangerous, that ordinary people lived in spiritual darkness, and that only inside the temple could true purity and wisdom exist. This teaching made them afraid of everything outside, made them believe that even if they could leave, they shouldn't want to, because only pain and damnation waited beyond the walls. The brainwashing was reinforced with endless rituals and repetition, the same songs every day, the same prayers, the same ceremonies, until the actions and words became automatic, until the beliefs felt real instead of forced. But not every woman accepted the brainwashing completely. Let me tell you what happened when Mutmuya, the girl from Nubia, turned 16. By then, she had been in the temple for 8 years. She had learned to speak Egyptian perfectly. She could sing the hymns and perform the rituals. She could weave and prepare offerings. She could move silently through the temple in perfect obedience. But she hadn't forgotten her mother's face. She hadn't forgotten the Nubian songs her mother used to sing. She hadn't forgotten that once she had been free, that she had run through open fields, swum in rivers, and laughed with her siblings. The memories were fading, like old dreams, but they were still there. One night, lying in the dark of the sleeping quarters, Mutmoya began to sing softly. Not the Egyptian hymn she was taught, but a Nubian song in her birth language, words she hadn't spoken in 8 long years.
The song was about home, about mothers and daughters, about freedom. An older temple woman heard Mutmuya singing. She went and told the overseer. The next morning, Mutmuya was dragged before the high priest. He demanded to know what language she had been singing in and what the words meant. Mutmuya tried to explain that it was just a song her mother had taught her, that she didn't mean any disrespect to the Egyptian gods. The high priest slapped her so hard that she fell to the floor. "You have no mother," he said coldly. "You have no language except the language the gods you serve. You have no songs except our hymns. You have no memories except the ones we give you. You are nothing. You exist only to serve." Mutmuya was punished by being locked in a storage room for 7 days with barely any food or water. When she came out, something inside her was broken in a way it hadn't been before. She never sang Nubian songs again. She tried not even to think in Nubian, afraid the priests would somehow know and punish her again. But late at night, sometimes the words would come to her mind on their own, and she would cry silently, mourning the loss of her memories, her language, and even the small act of remembering who she used to be. Now listen carefully, because this is where the story gets much worse than anything you've heard so far. Let me tell you about the ritual duties that certain temple women had to perform, duties that were written about in official temple records using beautiful, poetic language to hide what was truly happening. Duties that turned religion into organized exploitation. Some women, especially those called gods' wives, or those serving in temples of gods linked to fertility and birth, like Hathor or Mut, had roles in what were called sacred union or divine marriage rituals. These ceremonies were said to be reenactments of ancient myths, rituals where divine powers were called upon to bring order to the universe, to bless Egypt with fertile land and prosperity. The language used to describe these rituals sounded elegant and symbolic. The god enters his temple. Divine seed is planted. The goddess receives her consort. Beautiful words that could mean many things. But let me tell you what these rituals actually meant once you strip away the poetry. High-ranking priests, especially the high priest of Amun or other great temples, claimed they became the god during certain ceremonies. They dressed in costumes to look like the deity. They spoke in ritual language, claiming their voice was the god's, and they performed acts that were said to be the god working through them, but these were acts done with human bodies. Very real, very physical.
Women chosen for the sacred union were purified, dressed in ceremonial clothes, brought into inner rooms where outsiders weren't allowed, and told that they were about to receive the god's blessing. They were told that the god would enter them, that divine power would flow through them, that this was the highest honor a woman could ever have.
They were warned that fear or resistance would anger the god and bring disaster not just on them but on all of Egypt. And then, priests who claimed to be vessels of divine power would perform what they called divine marriage rites with these women, acts that in any normal situation would be seen as violation and abuse, but inside the temple were called sacred duty, holy ritual, and the will of the gods. Let me be completely clear about this. These were not relationships between equals. These were forced acts between powerful men who ruled every part of these women's lives and powerless women who had been trained since childhood to believe their bodies belonged to the gods and that priests spoke for those gods. The women couldn't refuse. They couldn't report what was done to them. They couldn't escape. They were told it was sacred, that it was a blessing, that they should feel grateful.
Let me tell you what happened to Nefertari when she was chosen for her first sacred union ritual. She was only 14 years old and had been in the temple for 5 years. The overseer told her she had been chosen for a great honor, that she would take part in the festival of the divine marriage, that the god Amun himself would bless her. Nefertari didn't understand what this really meant. She just knew she was being treated differently. She got better food, was bathed carefully, and dressed in the finest clothes she had ever worn. The other temple women looked at her with strange expressions she couldn't read. Some looked sad, others scared, and some looked relieved that it wasn't them. That night, Nefertari was brought into the inner sanctuary. The room glowed with dozens of oil lamps. The air was thick with incense smoke. The high priest stood before the altar, wearing a rich costume and a mask that made him look like the god himself. Other priests formed a circle around the sanctuary, chanting in the old ritual language. The high priest came closer to Nefertari and told her she was about to receive the god's blessing, that Amun himself would enter her, and that she must submit completely and without fear. Nefertari froze, confused. Then, when the priest's hands moved to remove her ceremonial garments, she understood. She tried to back away, tried to run, but the other priests grabbed her arms and held her still. The high priest told her she could not refuse the god, that to resist was blasphemy, and that if she failed, the gods would curse her and all of Egypt. Nefertari was terrified. She was 14 years old. For 5 years she had been taught to believe that priests spoke for the gods, that disobeying them would bring divine punishment. She had no one to help her, no place to run, and no strength to resist men who claimed holy power for what they were about to do. What happened next I won't describe in detail. You already understand. What was done to Nefertari in that sanctuary, surrounded by chanting priests and suffocating incense, with the high priest pretending to be the god himself, it was called sacred union. It was called divine blessing. It was recorded in temple records as a successful ritual. But even at 14, after 5 years of training and brainwashing, Nefertari knew that what had happened to her was not sacred.
It was not a blessing. It was abuse disguised as religion, exploitation hidden behind rituals, and there was nothing she could do about it. No one she could tell, no justice she could seek. Because the same men who had hurt her were the ones who decided what justice meant. They spoke for the gods. They controlled every part of her life. After the ritual, Nefertari was taken back to the sleeping quarters. The other women didn't look at her. Takayat, before she had been broken and taken away, had once whispered to Nefertari about sacred unions, what they really meant, and how every woman in the temple lived in fear of being chosen. Now Nefertari understood. Now she knew what all the other women already knew. This could happen again. It probably would happen again. And there was nothing any of them could do except obey and try to survive. Some women went through these sacred unions many times, chosen again and again for rituals that required female participants. How often it happened depended on the temple's calendar and which ceremonies needed this kind of ritual. Big festivals could have several of these rituals. Certain seasons connected with fertility or renewal brought even more ritual activity. And here's something even more disturbing. Some of these women had children because of these sacred unions. The children were said to be blessed, touched by divine favor, and destined to serve in the temple too.
but they were also proof of what had happened to their mothers. These children grew up in temple households, raised by their mothers, but also by the same system that had hurt those mothers. Daughters might follow their mothers into temple service. Sons might be trained as priests. The system fed itself, creating new victims from the pain of the last generation. When Nefertari was 16, she realized she was pregnant. She had been chosen for sacred union rituals 3 more times since the first one. She didn't know which priest was the father. She didn't know what would happen now. She was terrified. When her belly started to show, she was moved to different quarters where pregnant temple women lived. There were 6 other women there, all at different stages of pregnancy, all victims of the same system. For the first time since joining the temple, Nefertari could talk openly with other women about what had happened, how they felt, and their fears for the babies they carried. One older woman told her what to expect. The child will be taken from you after weaning. If it's a girl, she'll become a temple servant like us. If it's a boy, he'll be raised by the priests. You'll see the child sometimes, but the child won't really be yours. The child will belong to the temple, just like you do. This is our fate. This is what we are. Nefertari gave birth to a daughter 8 months later. The birth was hard. She nearly died from the bleeding. But she survived. And for 3 years she was allowed to keep her daughter with her to nurse and care for her. The daughter she secretly named Nephora, in her heart, even though the temple records gave her another name. Then the child was taken away to start her training as a temple servant.
Nefertari went back to her regular duties. She saw her daughter sometimes in the temple halls, but she wasn't allowed to show that she was her mother. The girl was taught to call all temple women mother, collectively, and none of them individually. Nefertari watched her daughter grow up from a distance, saw her being broken and trained the same way she herself had been, and she could do nothing. Not protect her, not save her, not even comfort her. That was the cruelest part. Not just being exploited herself, but watching her daughter get trapped in the same system. Knowing the cycle would continue. That her daughter might someday bear children through these sacred unions, that those children might grow up to become priests who would exploit other women. The system kept feeding itself, creating endless suffering and trauma. Now let me tell you what happened to the women who tried to fight this system, who refused their roles, who tried to escape or speak out about what was being done to them. The punishments were made to scare not just the woman being punished, but every other woman who saw it happen. Some temples practiced what they called purification through correction, rituals where women who were called impure or disobedient were punished in the name of spiritual cleansing. These punishments included long fasting, being forced to go days or even weeks with very little food or water while still working, or being locked alone in dark storage rooms or cells for unknown amounts of time. Sometimes they were beaten by older temple women while the priests watched to make sure the punishment was harsh enough. But there was something even worse than these punishments. It was saved for women who the temple thought committed the most serious crimes, those who tried to escape, who said they wanted to leave, who refused the sacred unions, or who questioned whether the priests really spoke for the gods. These women faced something called dedication to the desert, or return to chaos. Here's what that meant. The woman would be taken outside the temple grounds, which almost never happened, so everyone knew it was something extreme. She'd be taken far into the desert, beyond the fertile land, into the barren wilderness that Egyptians believed belonged to the god Set, the god of chaos and death. And then she'd be left there, alone, with no water, no food, no shelter, and no way back. The temple called it religious exile, saying she was being returned to chaos to let the gods decide if she deserved to live. But really, it meant death. Slow, painful death from heat, thirst, and starvation in a place that Egyptians saw as the worst kind of horror. Let me tell you about a woman named Hutmatite. She was in her mid-20s. She had served in the temple since she was 9. She had gone through sacred unions dozens of times. She had given birth to 3 children, all taken away from her. She had reached a breaking point where all the brainwashing stopped working, and she could no longer make herself believe that what was being done to her was sacred. One day, Hutmatite stood up during the midday meal and spoke loudly so that every temple woman in the dining hall could hear her. "This is not holy. These men are not gods. We are prisoners. We are used and thrown away. We should resist. We should refuse. We should escape."
The hall went completely silent. All the other women stared at Hanut-Mahit in shock and terror. An overseer ran to call the priests. Within minutes, guards came and grabbed Hanut-Mahit, dragging her before the high priest. The high priest didn't even speak to her. He just made a hand gesture, and the guards started pulling Hanut-Mahit toward the temple gates. She screamed and fought back. She begged the other women to help her, to join her, to fight back together. But no one moved. Everyone just stood there, frozen, watching in horror as Hanut-Mahit was dragged away. The temple women were forced to watch as Hanut-Mahit was taken out into the desert. They stood on the temple walls and saw her being marched farther and farther away until she looked like a tiny figure lost in the sand. Then the guards turned around and went back to the temple, leaving her alone, miles from any water or shelter, with the sun climbing higher in the sky. The women had to keep watching for hours. They saw Hanut-Mahit trying to walk back toward the temple, but guards on the walls shot arrows near her feet to make her turn back. They saw her collapse in the heat, get up again, wander in circles as the sun burned her skin and thirst made her lose her mind. By nightfall, Hanut-Mahit had stopped moving. The next day, the women were forced to go out and see her body. The temple wanted them to see exactly what happened to women who resisted. Hanut-Mahit had died from heat and thirst. Her body was already being eaten by scavengers. The sight was so terrible that several women vomited. The high priest stood before them and said, "This is what happens to the impure. This is what happens to those who betray their sacred vows. This is what the gods do to blasphemers. Let her body stay in the desert unburied. Let her spirit wander forever without rest. And let all of you remember what you have seen." Hanut-Mahit's body was left where it had fallen. No one was allowed to bury her. When the women returned to the temple, they were ordered never to speak her name again, to act as if she had never existed. But of course they remembered. They remembered every detail of her suffering and her death. That was the whole point. The memory kept them obedient and afraid for years. But here's the thing the priests probably didn't expect. The memory of Hanut-Mahit also became a different kind of lesson. Some women, instead of being broken into total submission, started to see clearly what they had always secretly known, but were too afraid to admit. This system wasn't sacred. It was pure exploitation. The priests weren't divine. They were men using religion to justify cruelty, and women like Hanut-Mahit, who resisted even knowing she would die for it, were heroes, not sinners.
The resistance had to be quiet, hidden, invisible, buried so deep that even the most watchful overseers couldn't detect it. But it was there. In the songs the women sang, songs that on the surface praised the gods, but secretly mocked the priests. In the glances they exchanged while the priests preached, looks that said, "We know this is a lie, even if we have to pretend to believe it." In small acts of rebellion, like weaving mistakes on purpose that spelled out secret words in the patterns, words like, "I am here," or "I remember," or "I resist." And sometimes women found ways to leave traces behind, secret messages, symbols, or hidden writings, tiny bits of truth that might survive even if they didn't, whispers that someone, someday, might hear. Now, let me tell you how these women's lives ended and how completely their identities were erased, even in death. Most temple women died within the temple walls, having spent their entire lives from childhood to old age, serving institutions that had consumed their bodies, their labor, and their very sense of self. When they died, they were buried not as people, but as temple property. Their burials showed their status, not as daughters or mothers or individuals, but as servants of the temple. Temple women were almost never buried with their families. That separation was complete, lasting even into death. Instead, they were buried in special temple burial areas, sometimes in mass graves, sometimes in simple, unmarked pits with no coffins, no monuments, nothing to preserve their memory. When Nefertari died at age 52, after 43 years of temple service, her body was barely prepared. She was wrapped in linen and placed in a shared burial pit with 3 other temple women who had died around the same time. There was no coffin, only wrappings. No funeral, just a short prayer mumbled by a junior priest.
no grave marker, nothing to show who she was or that she had ever lived. Her daughter, Nephura, who was now an adult and had spent her whole life in the temple just like her mother, was not allowed to mourn openly. She wasn't allowed to visit the burial site. She was expected to go back to her duties as if nothing had happened. Within days, the other temple women were told not to mention Nefertari, to act as if she had never existed. Her name wasn't recorded anywhere as someone worthy of remembrance. She had been a servant of the god, and now that service was over. That was all there was to say. This forgetting wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, part of the system. The temple leaders wanted these women to be erased as individuals. Their worth existed only in their service, not in their humanity. When they died, their use ended, and so did their memory. But here's where something remarkable happened.
Some of these women tried to fight against being erased. In the quiet corners of the temples, in places where no one was watching, some of them carved little messages into the stone. These carvings were tiny, quickly scratched, and easy to miss, but they were there. I was born free. They took that from me. Remember that we were people. My name was Mut Tamuya before they changed it. That name is dead, but I wanted to write it one time. I had 4 children. All were taken. I loved them, even though I wasn't allowed to. I was their mother, even though they never knew me. To whoever finds this, we suffered. We did not choose this. We were not blessed. We were prisoners. Tell our story if you can. These messages, carved in fear and hurry, during small moments stolen from their work, were the only way most temple women could leave a trace of their lives. They were desperate attempts to be remembered, to show that they once existed as real people, with thoughts, feelings, and lives that mattered. The women knew their carvings might never be seen, and even if found, people might not understand or believe them, but they still carved, because the thought of being completely erased without even trying to fight back was unbearable. They carved because even if those words stayed hidden for thousands of years, even if no one ever read them, the act of carving itself meant something. It was proof they had existed. It was their quiet way of saying, I was here. Mutuya, a Nubian girl who had been captured at age 8 and forced to serve in a temple for over 40 years, left her last message just 2 days before she died of a fever at age 49. She had stolen a small bronze tool from a workshop. In a dark storage room where she had been sent to count grain jars, she scratched her words into the wall. I came from beyond the first cataract. My mother's name was Amanat Tur.
She sang songs in Nubian. I still remember her voice, even though I haven't heard it in 41 years. I never forgot her. I never forgot who I was before they took me. This life was not my choice. These gods were not my gods. If anyone finds this, know that I existed. Know that I remembered. Know that I never stopped being Mutmoa of Nubia. Even when they called me by Egyptian names and said I belonged to their goddess, I was still me. I never gave that up, even when I lost everything else. She died 2 days later. Her message stayed there, hidden in the dark, unknown to the priests who buried her in an unmarked grave, unknown to her daughter, taken from her when she was only 3, who grew up never knowing her mother was once free in Nubia, unknown to the thousands who later walked past that same storage room for centuries. But the message stayed. Mutmoa's courage was carved in stone, lasting longer than the temple that tried to erase her. A whisper from the shadows, saying, I existed. I mattered. Remember me. This is what the temples of Egypt tried to hide. This is what the beautiful carvings on the walls don't show you. This is the truth behind the sacred language and divine pictures. Thousands of girls taken as children, used for decades, forgotten in death, leaving only small, hidden carvings as proof they lived. The temples still stand. Tourists still visit them, amazed by the huge columns, the statues, and the colorful walls. Guides still talk about pharaohs and gods and Egyptian glory, but almost no one talks about the temple women. Almost no one tells the story of the girls who were taken, the rituals that broke them, the pain that ruled their lives, and the silence that followed their deaths. But now you know. Now you understand what really happened behind those beautiful walls. Now when you see those temples, you can see the truth carved into the same stones, the suffering, the voices, the resistance. You can remember the women who lived and died there, who tried to fight back in the only ways they could, who left messages hoping someone, someday, would find them and understand.
They were Nefertari, just 9 years old when her father sold her to pay a debt. They were Mutua, 8 years old when soldiers took her from her Nubian home. They were Tayet, Anukmihet, Nephura, and thousands of others whose names were lost because their records were destroyed or never written. They were real people. They suffered. They existed. And they deserve to be remembered, not as servants of gods or as parts of temple systems, but as human beings who went through unimaginable suffering, yet still found ways to resist, to remember, and to leave behind a message for someone to hear. What do you think about this story? How should we see these ancient monuments that were built on so much pain? Should we ever trust religious power without questioning it? What parts of this story still happen in today's world? Leave your thoughts below. If you believe history like this needs to be told, if you think truth is more important than comfort, then subscribe to this channel. We uncover the darkest sides of ancient history with real evidence and sources. We give a voice to those whose pain was meant to be forgotten. We remember the victims that history tried to erase. So hit the subscribe button and share this video with anyone who needs to know that not everything beautiful is good, and not everything called sacred was holy. History is full of pain, and it's our job to remember it. The temples still stand, the stones still remember, and now, so do you. See you in the next video.